Good evening, everyone. I'm Stephen Bartkus, the curator of the Gunn Historical Museum in Washington, Connecticut. Thank you for joining us for the second of our two very interesting lectures about the Shepaug River, titled The Story of a River, Rallies to Save the Shepaug. The river's natural beauty and force have been attracting people to Washington for thousands of years up to our present time. Tonight, our guest, Edwin Matthews, will be illuminating the river's more recent history and the fight to save it. Gene Solomon, a trustee of the Gunn Memorial Library and Museum, will be introducing him. This lecture is being recorded and will be available for viewing on our website. During the lecture, we ask that you please mute both your audio and video settings. If you have any questions, you may submit them throughout the lecture in the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and Edwin will answer some of them at the end. Now, I'd like to hand it over to Gene.
Gene Solomon. For those who are joining us for the first time, it is my pleasure to welcome our guest lecturer, Edwin Matthews. For the past 30 years, Edwin has been active in the defense of the Shepaug River litigation that resulted in an agreement to limit diversions of water from the river by Waterbury. He was a founder of Friends of the Earth International, a worldwide environmental organization, now in 75 countries. For many years, he has served as a trustee of the Steep Rock Association and Earth Justice, a not-for-profit law firm for the environment. Mr. Matthews lives on a farm here in Washington, Connecticut. He is an accomplished attorney, an author, and my friend. He has also published a book of essays on wildness around us, entitled Litchfield Country Journal. Thank you, Edwin, for your participation here this evening. Now I'll hand this over to you.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you, Stefan, for researching the illustrations for this lecture and for your kind introduction. The story of the Shepaug River that began 10,000 years ago continues in our time. It became a lawsuit and a rally to save the river from diversions by Waterbury. At the end of the first lecture, we left the Shepaug in 1997, starving for water in the summer. Citizens expressed growing anger as they watched their beloved river suffer from low flows caused by the diversions of water from its river by our neighbor, Waterbury. Attempts to negotiate a solution with Waterbury had failed. Waterbury was always unyielding. But river advocates were increasingly determined to save their treasured river. As we were now in court, the fate of the river was in the hands of one person, Judge Beverly Hodgkin of the Connecticut Superior Court in Waterbury. Both parties were facing years of expensive litigation. We had to assemble a whole team of lawyers and experts to make the case for the river. And we had also find a way to pay for that. Waterbury was no longer the brass capital of the world and had fallen on hard times. All through the litigation, it would make sense for the parties to find a solution for the river. We kept trying backdoor approaches to the city, arguing that there was a way out of this that would benefit all sides, but Waterbury's mayor would not talk. More on Mayor Phil Giordano later. Since the 1930s, the Shepaug had not been a free-flowing stream. Its flows were controlled by Waterbury. Therefore, it was essential at the beginning to understand the operation of the Waterbury water system and the available water. This information was kept confidential by Waterbury. We had no access to the dams, or the reservoirs. It was essential for us to understand this system. It was designed in the 1920s to provide water to the city's burgeoning grass mills and growing population. This chart represents the 3 reservoirs on the right, located in the watershed of the Naugatuck River that runs through Waterbury. On the left of the chart are represented the 2 dams and reservoirs that Waterbury had built in the upper Shepaug in the 1930s and 50s. Because the Shepaug reservoirs were higher in elevation than the Naugatuck reservoirs, a long 7-mile tunnel aqueduct had been drilled under Bantam Lake, shown here by a line with arrows. Thanks to our friend, gravity, water flowed naturally from the Shepaug to the Naugatuck reservoirs. Now, under a federal mandate to cleanse all drinking water, in the 1980s, Waterbury added a water treatment plant, represented here by a box with the letters WTP. And this plant was placed, and this fact was revealing, above the Waterbury's lowest reservoir, the Wigwam. Until the close of World War II, Waterbury's growing consumption of water averaged 30 or more million gallons a day. The city faced periodic water famines. Waterbury's ambitious reservoir system was designed to supply these shortages from the Shepaug River and protect the brass mills. These mills use large quantities of water to cool and wash their castings. But as times change, by the time our generation enters the picture, the brass mills had closed. Waterbury's industry and population was in decline. Its consumption had been reduced to about half of what it was, that is, about 17 million gallons per day or less. Now, before Waterbury built the dams, the Shepaug River flows varied widely between winter, spring floods, and summer dry periods. And since the river was dammed in the 1930s, median summer flows of the river in the summer months, absent unusual rain, never exceeded 1.5 million gallons. This was a small fraction of the spring flows, and the median flows ranged from 50 million gallons in February to over 100 in April and back to 50 in May. Unless the dam on the Shepaug was overflowing, at no time did the river ever receive more than 1.5 million gallons from its source after the dams were built. Now, in order to understand the operation of the Waterbury's ambitious reservoir system, we built a secret weapon. George Ward, who was an engineer, and his son, Charles, went to work to design a computer model of the water system. We had to know why the river was not receiving its needed supply. And Waterbury had always claimed that the diversions were necessary and could not be reduced. Could they? This analysis could not have been done before the computer, because we first had to import in the model records from the US Weather Service for 100 years of past rainfall to the Shepaug watershed. Then we assumed different rules of operations for the reservoir and set the program to provide a minimum quantity of water to Waterbury, more than its current demand. Now, one night I had an urgent call from George Ward. He insisted, thankfully George was always insisting, that I come immediately to his house. He played me the latest model on the computer system. What we saw together on the screen that evening was surprising. We watched as the model played 100 years of operation of the reservoirs on the screen at accelerated speed, showing rises and falls of the reservoirs in accordance with the rainfall. In a few precious minutes, it was revealed to us that if Waterbury's demand was its present 17 million gallons, there would be 20 million or more left over for the river each year. In other words, 10 or 20 times the 1.5 million that the river was supposed to receive under that old 1921 contract. Could it be that there was plenty of water for both Waterbury and the river, and that with different operating rules, low flows and the river could be avoided, we asked? Now, this startling discovery, revealed to us for the first time by the computer model, was later confirmed and refined by our expert hydrologist. But that left us still to understand why Waterbury was taking so much water from the Shepaug, water that Waterbury apparently did not need. What was happening to the Shepaug water? Under the Connecticut Environmental Protection Statute, we had some good law. In the 1970s, under the impetus of the worldwide environmental movement, Connecticut had passed this law, which allows lawsuits by citizens to protect air, water, and other natural resources of the state from unreasonable impairment or damage. Under the law, therefore, we could argue that if Waterbury did not need the water from the Shepaug, its diversions would amount to an unreasonable impairment of the river in violation of the statute, even though under the 1921 contract, the only release required was 1.5 million gallons a day. By analyzing the reservoir levels over time, we next discovered that Waterbury was not even using its lowest reservoir, the Wigwam, shown here with a red circle around Wigwam. As mentioned above, in 1984, Waterbury had built its water treatment plant higher than the Wigwam. In order to use water from its reservoir, therefore, water had to be pumped uphill from the Wigwam to the water treatment plant. Now, we next learned that the minimum capacity of Wigwam's pumps was 15 to 30 million gallons, which equal or is twice what Waterbury's entire demand for water is. There were 2 pumps. Each pump's capacity was 15 million gallons when it ran. The pumps, we concluded, must have been designed to use the Wigwam only in an extreme emergency, when water from the Shepaug and the other reservoirs was unavailable. The Wigwam is being replaced by the Shepaug. Waterbury had several other reasons for preferring the Shepaug over the Wigwam as a source. We learned that water from the Shepaug, which flowed to Waterbury's highest reservoir on the Naugatuck side, called the Pitch, was used to generate power as it flowed to the treatment plant, which meant a cost saving if they used water from the Shepaug. And as the cost of pumping from the Wigwam would be significant, although not a large amount in the Bureau's budget, they wished to avoid pumping for that reason. Also, as the water from the Shepaug was Class A pure drinking water, it did not have to be treated as much as water from the Naugatuck reservoirs. It was now clear to us that in the 1980s, Waterbury had decided to depend increasingly on the Shepaug River and use less its reservoirs on the Naugatuck side, which is what Waterbury had been doing without telling anybody. This enabled us to argue that diversions which damaged the Shepaug could be avoided and were unreasonable under the statute, and therefore illegal. Now, we further discovered that Waterbury had been violating the 1921 contract. It was not maintaining its minimum release of 1.5 million gallons to the river because the pipe feeding the river from the Shepaug Dam was obstructed, had been obstructed for years with debris. And more importantly, because Waterbury was not using the Wigwam, it was taking water from the Shepaug when the Wigwam was overflowing, which violated an express provision of the 1921 contract. And Waterbury had also been selling water to other towns, which they promised not to do under the 1921 contract. Although we objected to these sales, we did not ultimately oppose sales of water to Watertown and Walcott, because we felt that the Shepaug River would never be allowed to prevail over human needs. And our interest was in saving the river and maintaining our strongest arguments. But our case remained difficult to prove. In order to establish that, in addition to establishing that Waterbury's divisions were avoidable with proper management of the water system, we had to prove, in order to prevail in court, that the Shepaug River was impaired by low flows. Now, it may be obvious to any reasonable human being that a river without water is damaged. We still had to leave the judge no choice but to find that the river suffered from low flows. Now, how do you do that? Well, we first had our expert hydrologist build a model of the river to show by cross sections along the length of the river how the surface area and the depth of the river would increase with greater flows. For example, this slide is a cross section of the Shepaug in Hidden Valley. That assumes a flow of 30 million gallons a day. Other transcripts showed the effect of other flows, including the 1.5 million contractual minimum under the agreement. We also had to prove, of course, how low water flows would make, what a difference they would make to life in the river. So how do you show what difference water makes to life? This is where aquatic insects came to the rescue of the river. We knew that fish and other life depended on aquatic insects. And we also knew that these insects and their larvae depended on water. Might the insect population, we asked, in the river therefore reveal that life in the Shepaug suffered from low water flows? We hired an aquatic ecologist from the University of North Carolina, a professor, to count insects in the river. Now, our professor proceeded systematically first to count mayflies, caddisflies, and stoneflies in the upper reaches of the Shepaug, above the dams, and then also at various points in the Shepaug downstream. This is actually a sophisticated undertaking. Our expert first impounded a cubic meter of water from various points on the river, and then took the samples of the river to North Carolina, where the number of flies and their larvae in each sample were painstakingly identified and counted by the professor's graduate students. Insect life is a basic measure of the health of a river ecosystem, because all life, fish, amphibians, and reptiles and mammals, depends either or directly or indirectly on the insects. These insects are the primary source of food for trout in the Shepaug. They are an indicator species that measures the health of the life in the river. Our professor found that there were many fewer insects in the lower water-starved Shepaug than in the upper reaches of the river above the dams. As we could not call the insects to testify as witnesses in a trial, we introduced the professor's report. His report concluded that all life in the river, measured by the aquatic insects, was impaired by the low flows. Never before had the fate in court of an ancient river depended on such modest creatures. But the life of the Shepaug does every day. Now, and although it's obvious to any normal human being that you cannot float without water, we had to prove that the river without water was not useful for human recreation. We could not leave any conclusion to the obvious. We found other experts in Oregon who had advised the U.S. National Park Service. They systematically documented how river recreation, whether fishing or boating or aesthetic appreciation, was impaired by low flows. They calculated, for example, the river flows required for tubing, for drag boating, for scenic boating, and whitewater boating. They even determined that to canoe the Shepaug in the summer required over 200 portages. Hundreds of visitors to the river were interviewed and asked what they thought about the Shepaug without water. They provided colorful testimony of how the public felt about their river without water. Now, as our overriding concern in this struggle was to save our river, we kept trying to negotiate a reasonable compromise, but were disappointed by Waterbury's intransigence. This leads me to make an apology to Leonard Assar, a former superintendent of the water company, to whom I attributed a comment disparaging the river in my first talk on the Shepaug. The other day, Lenny Assar paid me a friendly call to point out that he had left the Bureau years before and could not have made this remark. The statement that I did hear and that reflected Waterbury's attitude, however, must have been made by one of his successors, not Leonard. Now, we had several meetings with Mayor Giordano. None were productive. I remember our first meeting in the 1990s when the mayor greeted us in his office with his feet in shiny cowboy boots on his desk. He started the meeting by asking, "Tell me why I should care about your goddamn river." This statement was a clear signal that the city would not settle for the sake of the river. My answer to the mayor that day, and that we repeated throughout the battle, was that our sole aim was to protect the river, a precious public resource. That we believed there was enough water for both the river and Waterbury, and that the mayor would get all the credit for a settlement that would both protect the Waterbury's water supply and avoid the expense of a lawsuit that Waterbury could ill afford. But the mayor was not listening. We were learning that for Waterbury, the struggle over the Shepaug was not about water. It's, as experts testified at the trial, there was plenty of water. For Giordano, the argument was about whether anyone else would have a say in Waterbury's affairs, whether the operation of the reservoir system would have to take into account collateral damage to a river in other towns, all colored by his resentment of favored Northwest Connecticut towns. The fight was with Giordano. Now, lawsuits are expensive. As we proceeded with the litigation, many understandably questioned how we could pay for this large-scale undertaking. Although the value of a river is incalculable, and the towns overwhelmingly supported the cause of the river, we nevertheless had to pay for busy lawyers, experts from around the country, volumes of document production, and days of depositions. From the beginning, we had to assure the towns that the lawsuit would not impact the town budgets. Well into the litigation, we reached an agreement with our extraordinary counsel, William Bright in Hartford. Bill's firm agreed to be paid only a modest current fee, and in return would be entitled to a multiple bonus should the court award us attorney's fees, to which we would be entitled should we win. But because we agreed to settle the case, this bonus was never paid. But Bill's firm and other lawyers gave freely of their time and advice. In the end, everyone contributed generously, and nobody, except the river, got rich. Special thanks here must go to Washington's John Millington, who had replaced George Ward as the chairman of Steep Rock. John was instrumental in our raising over $1.5 million. His charm and passion yielded contributions for more than 400 people, including both wealthy residents and schoolchildren who gave as little as a nickel from their allowance. We distributed cans labeled Save Our Shepaug for smaller contributions. On one lovely summer evening at a crucial stage in 1999, our sister town, Roxbury, gave a fundraising party along the river where we were handed a check for $60,000. Our message was always the same, that with everyone's help, we could do what was possible, and we would, to save the Shepaug. And everyone loved their river. The trial in the case of Waterbury versus Washington began on December 9, 1999, and lasted a full 6 weeks. I remember the first day when the mayor arrived in court, after the judge had already been seated. He walked slowly forward, stone-faced, as though he was leading a solemn procession. His full-length camel hair coat stretched all the way to the ground, but you could still see his shiny black boots. On arriving in front of the bench, Mayor Phil Giordano planted himself in a large armchair, alone, directly in front of the judge. Counsel and witnesses were off to either side, as if less important. Giordano folded his arms and stared aggressively at the judge, as if to show that it was the mayor of Waterbury who was deciding this case, not the judge. But as it should, the court proceeded, notwithstanding, and 6 weeks of testimony followed. As the trial was concluding, a representative of the State Department of Health, which oversees water systems, testified that the city could release more water to the river without endangering its water supply. This validated what we had been saying for years. Our expert hydrologist explained to the court in detail how Waterbury could operate its system and release more water to the Shepaug and still meet its needs. Although Waterbury occupied the court for weeks of testimony and legal maneuvers, it was unable successfully to challenge these arguments. And the court rendered its decision with remarkable speed on February 16th, 2000. Now, when I read the first line of Judge Hodgkin's 85-page opinion, I knew we'd won. She rejected the city's claims in finding for the public interest in the natural condition of a beautiful and nearly pristine river. She held that we had proved that Waterbury's diversions constitute an unreasonable impairment of the public trust in the river as a natural resource. The mayflies, the stoneflies, and caddisflies had indeed come to the defense of the river. And the judge also found that the aesthetic appeal of the river was impaired, with large areas left dry and parched looking more frequently than it would be in its natural state. She found that the city had feasible and prudent alternatives that would enable it to maintain an ample water supply without damaging the Shepaug River. By altering the pattern of its storage reservoirs, by imposing long neglected, non-burdensome conservation measures, and by small changes in its equipment, the judge found that the city could meet its water needs at reasonable cost. Now, the judge also found that Waterbury had violated the 1921 contract by taking water from the Shepaug when its reservoirs were full and overflowing, principally the Wigwam. This aged, moth-eaten contract was alive and binding still. Finally, the court held that the city had infringed riparian rights of towns and land trusts along the river. Riparian rights came to us from ancient English law and entitles those who own land along the river to a natural flow of the river, undiminished in quantity and unimpaired in quality. As a remedy, the court prohibited the city from taking any water from the Shepaug that would lower the flow of the river to less than stated amounts. As seen in this chart, from 34.3 million gallons per day in May to 9.8 million in October. She required Waterbury to modify the lower Shepaug Dam to produce variable releases. And Waterbury was expressly prohibited from taking any water from the Shepaug when its water reservoirs and the Naugatuck watershed, including the Wigwam, were full and overflowing. Following our court victory, our groups were cited for protecting the river. And Judge Hodgkin's decision was viewed as precedent-setting. But the battle was not over. Waterbury appealed the court's decision. And in 2002, the Supreme Court sent the case back to Judge Hodgkin to reconsider the case in the light of an obscure state regulation of minimum stream flows for rivers stocked with fish. The judges of the Supreme Court were apparently as if from another era. They were uncomfortable enforcing citizens' remedies under the Environmental Protection Statute and preferred that stream flows be set by state regulations, unfortunately, that are usually heavily determined by interested, well-funded business interests and not by the public. Although not mentioned, I believe that the Supreme Court was also troubled because, as the prevailing party, our side was entitled to recover millions of dollars of legal fees from Waterbury. Our claim would have put Waterbury into bankruptcy. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court decision created some bad law for the future of environmental protection claims. But our concern remained about the river, not about making law. After the trial, there had occurred another incredible development. On July 26, 2001, the year following the court's decision, Mayor Philip Giordano was arrested by the FBI and charged with dreadful crimes. He was removed as mayor and ultimately sentenced to 37 years in prison. His conviction followed the convictions and jail sentences on other crimes of both of his two predecessor mayors. Giordano now safely resides in federal prison, where he can do no more harm to others, including the Shepaug River. But his removal opened the way for reasonable settlement for the river. With Giordano's departure, a new mayor, Michael Jarjura, provided new leadership to the city. Waterbury was broke. Both sides wished to avoid further legal expenses that neither could afford. Waterbury could not count on the trial court to be sympathetic in further proceedings. The outcome of further court proceedings was uncertain for both sides. And as there was plenty of water, there was an obvious compromise. With our hydrologist, Stuart Stein from Virginia, who had testified at the trial, modeling various solutions, it was surprisingly easy to agree with Waterbury on the terms of an agreement to protect the river. And after approval by the towns, a settlement was signed in March of 2005. What does it provide? The agreement sets rules for the operation of Waterbury's reservoir system and requires managed releases of water to the river. I will try to summarize the complex rules of the settlement. First, there are managed releases that ensure a minimum flow to the Shepaug. As long as the total system storage of the Waterbury water system is above a stated level, Waterbury must release at least 12 million gallons a day to the river from July 1 through September, and 6 million gallons a day during May and October. From November 1 through April 30, Waterbury must release 1.5 million gallons a day. Waterbury must operate the water system to maximize its total system storage. But if that falls below the stated level, summer releases can be cut to 6 million gallons a day. Now, in addition, the agreement provides for rules for the operation of Waterbury's reservoirs, which limit diversions from the Shepaug. As a general rule, Waterbury is only allowed to divert water from the Shepaug when the Waterbury reservoirs are below spillway. And Waterbury is also at the same time using the Wigwam. Waterbury can no longer prefer the Shepaug as a water source. And no diversions are permitted within 15 days following the release of any water from the Shepaug, from the Wigwam. In order to comply with the settlement, Waterbury needed to install new pumps at the Wigwam and modify the Shepaug Dam, for which the legislature made a grant to the city of $3 million. The U.S. Geological Survey agreed to maintain a gauging station below the Shepaug Dam to measure the Shepaug flows. These measures in cubic feet per second are available online to the public at all times at usgs.gov/Peters-Weir-Woodville. Since the implementation of the agreement with Waterbury, the Shepaug River Association, with support from the towns and land trusts, has retained its hydrologist to conduct regular audits of Waterbury's performance. These reports, which are copied to Waterbury, have confirmed that Waterbury has been in substantial compliance with the agreement. However, in order to ensure future observance of the agreement, it is essential that Waterbury's performance be verified. The most recent review, covering the years of 2017 through 2019, is now in process. Now, given that the settlement agreement will last far into the future, one must ask, does the settlement restore the Shepaug flows? Will the river have enough water despite Waterbury's diversions? Being mindful that river flows always are dependent on rainfall, and that they have been greater in the winter and low in the summer months, even before Waterbury built the Shepaug dams. The answer is that assuming Waterbury performs the agreement, and it is our job in the future regularly to monitor Waterbury's performance and hold its feet to the fire, the Shepaug should not be adversely affected by Waterbury's diversions. Our hydrologists have advised that if the settlement agreement is followed, the river should have more water in the summer months than it would have had in its natural state. Why is this? This is because the Shepaug reservoirs must now store water over the winter that Waterbury is required to release in the summer to the river. Absent a drought, the Shepaug summer flows are likely to be greater than they have been since the 1930s, when the diversions began, and greater than the river had before the Shepaug dams and diversion tunnel were built. After it was all over, although when it comes to protecting a river, nothing is ever all over, a picnic was staged along the river for hundreds to celebrate the river and also to celebrate our success. Waterbury's new mayor, Jarjura, and the new superintendent of the water company were welcomed to address those assembled. Although we were former antagonists, everyone praised the restoration of the Shepaug. We also thank the state for helping Waterbury pay with its grant. Certainly many of those present must have wondered why it had taken so many years to solve a water problem whose solution seems written on a wall. Some wondered about the cost of the precious river from years of illegal diversions, and about the large human and money resources required, especially since the 1990s, to save it. The battle to save the Shepaug River actually began in 1920, and the cause of the river only prevailed after 100 years of committed defense, involving thousands and costing millions. The celebration was appropriately honor the beloved river and bury spurs, not to settle scores, which will fade in human memory. Many present at the picnic might also have wondered what would have been the fate of the Shepaug River had there been less committed and brave advocates. How many life-giving streams without advocates have been lost? What other life-sustaining natural features of our precious earth are being destroyed every day by purposeful, even mindless human action? What will it take for us to respect, indeed love, nature enough to fight for it? Thank you. I'll be delighted to answer your questions. Stephen?
Yes, thank you, Edwin. Thank you very much for sharing the story of the Shepaug River with us today. If anyone in the audience has any questions for Edwin, please type them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and he'll be able to answer some of them for you. Let's start off with a question about Waterbury's defense of their position in the lawsuit. Can you talk about how they defended their position in court?
Well, they produced testimony essentially to attack what we were saying. And then we proceeded to attack their testimony, attacking our testimony. There were a lot of legal maneuvers. But Waterbury did not present in the trial anything that challenged our arguments. We had the facts on our side, and we kept arguing the facts, and ultimately you cannot argue with facts. So it wasn't until they got to the Supreme Court that they argued differently, that the court should not be involved in citizen suits under the Environmental Protection Statute. That argument, which is contrary to the statute itself, found sympathy among the judges in the Supreme Court. And that was a reason for their reversal, in addition to the problems that I alluded to a minute ago. So we then were faced with continuing litigation and expense and an uncertain result. But a big difference was that Waterbury had a reasonable, honest mayor. And actually, it was not difficult to reach an agreement to settle the river dispute. I could have perhaps gone into detail over Waterbury's arguments and why they didn't make sense, but the judge actually found in our favor. I think that that is what is relevant to us and important to know.
Thank you. We have a question from Ethan. He is asking, when will the results of the review of Waterbury's compliance with the settlement be available, and what are the penalties for non-compliance?
Oh, that's a good question. We have about three reviews that have occurred over a number of years. They are available, and we've given them to Waterbury and discussed them with Waterbury. Essentially, they found substantial compliance. some mistakes, some problems, but they were only lasting a few days, and Waterbury recognized the problems. The most recent review is now in process, and I've been in discussions with Waterbury to get the data to permit the review sent to our hydrologist. That data is voluminous and needs to be analyzed and input into a computer. Only in a computer program actually determine whether Waterbury is performing the agreement or not. It's very difficult to do that manually and to do that without the help of a computer. That review is ongoing. Waterbury is being cooperative, and although it takes often several months to do, it's not something that should be a problem. If we found substantial issues of non-compliance, the settlement agreement requires us first to tell the superintendent of the water company and to meet with them and present our arguments and our problems. And then if Waterbury does not agree, we're entitled to go back to court, and the court would then decide whether Waterbury's living up to the agreement or not. That has not happened. I hope it won't have to happen.
Thank you. We have a question from Sunny and Frank. Who or what entity sold the headwaters to the city of Waterbury?
Well, that land was owned by a fishing club called the Shepaug Fishing Club. And I have heard, well, I noticed that the deed from the Shepaug Fishing Club to Waterbury was signed at Abercrombie and Fitch's fishing store on Madison Avenue. In the old days, it was a beautiful luxury fishing store that was and I believe that some of the people who were in the club were also shareholders in the brass mills. So I think that, without having any evidence to prove it, I just suspect that the shareholders, the financial interests behind the brass mills, got together with the fishing club and paid the fishing club, I don't know how much, for the land, and agreed to give a lease to the fishing club so that the fishing club, in addition to being able to be paid a large amount of money, were able to continue to use the reservoirs and the land for fishing and hunting. I only heard, and that lease lasted for probably 100 years. I heard just last week that Waterbury did not renew the lease of the fishing club. So they no longer are able to fish on the river, on the reservoir.
Thank you.
It would be interesting to know the background, because I suspect that it was the financial interests, New York financial interests in the brass mills that was able to arrange the sale of the land to Waterbury. Of course, when the sale occurred, the leaders, town fathers in Washington were horrified and began to be very worried and start the battle with Waterbury to preserve the river, which is continuing still today. Stephen?
Thank you. We have a question from David. When you mentioned the Supreme Court, he's wondering if you were referring to the state of Connecticut or the United States Supreme Court.
No, the state of Connecticut Supreme Court. The U.S. Supreme Court, although its record on environmental issues is not stellar, there's no federal issue here. There's no constitutional issue, no federal statute involved. So it went to the state Supreme Court, and that's where it stopped. We were very surprised by their reversal, and which really nobody expected. They had their own agenda. But look, because we had a great decision from the lower court, and we were going back to the judge, that same judge, and Waterbury had no assurance that they would get any relief. So I think Waterbury made the right decision, and I think we did too. Both sides were able to settle, and without the risks of further and cost of further litigation. So, but it was the US Supreme Court. They were not involved.
Thank you. We have a question from Dimitri. He asks, was the earlier battle to keep the Army Corps of Engineers from damming the Shepaug as a water source for southern Connecticut of any effect in the battle?
Not really, not at all, actually, because first of all, although the Army Corps looked at the Shepaug River as a source of power, this, remember, was after Waterbury had built its dams. So the Army Corps, I believe, found that there really wasn't enough water in the Shepaug to make it worth building a power dam. More interestingly, though, that in about 1968, the Congress passed a law to preserve wild and scenic rivers in America. And 144 rivers, including the Shepaug, were designated for study. And the Shepaug was recommended for preservation. Unfortunately, nothing came of that, although because the town fathers in Washington and other local parties were very nervous about having the federal government take over and preserve the river. On the other hand, they were not able to put in place any meaningful local restrictions on the diversions. So the wild and scenic rivers in America were preserved without preserving the Shepaug, and the risks to the river and the diversions continued. We got to the point, obviously, we were at the point in the 1990s when only a court was going to be able to solve this problem.
Thank you. We have another
Other questions?
Yes, another question from Ethan. He is curious to know more about the Shepaug River Association. Could you describe its current activities and how can people get involved in the organization?
Well, everybody is welcome. We have a small board that includes representatives of the land trusts and the towns. The first selectmen of Roxbury and Washington are members, and a small group of volunteers. And our activities have been, since the trial, limited to monitoring Waterbury's performance. And each time we do a review, it costs about $6,000 now to do it. And that cost is shared among the various towns and land trusts. Contributions are always welcome to Box 279, Shepaug River Association, Washington Depot, Connecticut. However, we have not undertaken any other measures to protect the river, except for one I might mention. Waterbury is attached to our settlement agreement is Waterbury's conservation plan. conserving water is important to both Waterbury and to the Shepaug. Water that's lost or wasted is lost to the river and lost to Waterbury. There were discussions beginning several years ago when Waterbury announced that they wanted to modify their water conservation plan. We hired a consultant who we worked with for the trial to review their plan and provide comments. The Shepaug River Association paid for that, and our comments were given to Waterbury. And then nothing has happened, and Waterbury has not proceeded with further revisions of its water plan. But Waterbury has a new superintendent with whom I have met and who I believe intends to be a loyal partner with us on the river. So I'm hopeful that we will be able to improve the water conservation plan. But that is a negotiation that has not yet begun.
Thank you. We have a question from Sally, and she's asking about what you consider the headwaters of the Shepaug River to be. She's wondering if you think it begins in Goshen with the beginning of the Shepaug River draining out of Tyler Lake and West Side Pond above it.
I'm not sure I can answer that question because I don't know where those rivers flow, and they may indeed flow east. The headwaters of the Shepaug essentially embrace the path of the river and begin just near 202, where 202 crosses the Shepaug and goes north. And the Shepaug, the old tributaries of the Shepaug, fanned out into small streams after several miles. I don't think that the bodies that you mentioned are in the same watershed. But I'm not sure. I'm sorry.
Thank you. We have a question from Ethan. He starts off with a comment. Connecticut's Metropolitan District Commission manages reservoirs which supply the Farmington River with water. By all accounts, the Farmington River is an excellent example of balancing municipal water interests with the broader public's interests. In particular, the river is a nationally known trout fishery that generates substantial tourist dollars for the riparian communities. Could this serve as a model by which we promote new ways to advance the Shepaug River?
Well, I don't think so, although the Farmington is a good model, but there are differences between the Shepaug and the Farmington. Farmington has more water. It's also, its geography does not lend to its being captured by a hungry utility like Waterbury. But going forward, the big difference is that the Shepaug River now is unique in Connecticut because we have an agreement that effectively manages the river. And the state does not have a direct role. It's up to us to monitor performance. And if we have problems, we will be going back to court. The Superior Court in Waterbury has retained jurisdiction of our matter and is available in the future should we have a problem with a non-respect of the agreement. But the status of the Shepaug River, because of what's happened, our litigation and the settlement is now unique. It's not necessarily a model for other rivers, although it might be.
Thank you. A question about the current water quality and flow of the Shepaug River. Is it where it needs to be, or is there anything that needs to be done in the future in coming years to improve the water quality and water flow of the Shepaug River?
Well, the water that comes out of the Shepaug Dam and the headwaters of the Shepaug River is drinking water. It's Class A pure water. That's why Waterbury was interested in it. When it reaches the Bantam confluence, the quality declines to being swimmable but not drinkable. And that is because the Bantam River is polluted by the sewage treatment plant of Litchfield. That plant is an old facility. It needs to be modernized. There's no reason today, technically, why this pollution should be continuing. We've looked at objecting to the renewal of the license that Litchfield has for this plant on its renewal. However, the law does not allow citizens to intervene in a renewal procedure. But someday, Litchfield is going to have to modernize its plant and obtain a new license. And in that event, those defending the Shepaug River should be there, representing the river. And that will be important. There's always something to do to protect the Shepaug. And over the years, there have been improvements. Remember that industry in Washington used to pollute the river. And only 20 or 30 years ago, there were serious problems with pollution of the river downstream. Septic systems that emptied into the river, treatment with pesticides and herbicides of especially cornfields that drained into the river, and other issues. Those have one by one been addressed and resolved, and there will be other issues. The river doesn't protect itself. It relies on us.
Thank you. If anyone else has any other questions for Edwin, please type them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to share a comment from Barbara Henry over in Roxbury. She says, I'd like to personally extend my thanks and the thanks from not only the Roxbury Board of Selectmen, but the residents of Roxbury to Edwin, and acknowledge that if it weren't for the efforts of many people, but in particular Edwin, who kept us not only focused, but took the fight to the right people and found the experts we needed, still, today, it is very comforting to know that he remains involved and on top of what is going on with the Shepaug to ensure its health for years to come.
Well, that leads me to thank Barbara and other officials in our towns, especially Roxbury and Washington, who over the years supported this campaign. And it wasn't easy. Getting involved in a costly, long lawsuit with an uncertain result is not the easiest cause to sell to citizens. But Barbara Henry and others in Roxbury have been terrific. And that's what protected the river. Having the support of everyone was essential. And we had that. And that made this battle not only rewarding, but successful.
Thank you. I see that we've reached the end of our questions. I would like to remind everyone about Edwin's book. I encourage you all to check it out. It's called Litchfield County Journal, Notes on Wildness Around Us. It's available at the Hickory Stick Bookshop in Washington Depot. And with that, I'd like to thank you again, Edwin, for the great work that you and your team did to save the Shepaug River for present and future generations. Thank you for all joining us this evening. Please stay safe and be well. Good night.
Thank you, Stephen.